In the sleepy outskirts of Cedar Springs, Colorado, Mike Thorne's auto repair shop had been a cornerstone of reliable service and honest work for almost 2 decades. Nobody would have guessed that this unassuming mechanic, who spent his days quietly fixing engines and rarely speaking about his past, would become the catalyst for a series of events that would transform an entire neighborhood. When a group of privileged teens from the exclusive Oakwood Hills district decided to target his modest garage, they thought they were dealing with just another simple working man who couldn't stand up to their influential families. What they didn't know was that Mike Thorne had earned his Silver Star commanding one of the most elite Delta Force units in Afghanistan, and their actions would set in motion a chain of events that would expose corruption reaching the highest levels of local power. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered concrete of Thorne's auto service as Mike methodically went through his opening routine. The familiar scent of motor oil and metal shavings filled the air as he unlocked the heavy steel doors, his movements precise and economical. Habits ingrained from years of military service that never quite faded. The garage wasn't much to look at from the outside, its faded blue paint and simple sign a stark contrast to the gleaming dealerships that had sprung up closer to town. But locals knew it as the place where honest work still meant something. Chen, his young apprentice, mechanic, was already inside, checking inventory in the parts room. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail as she worked, reminding Mike of her mother, an army medic who'd saved his life during a classified operation years ago. Now, at 23, Ruby ran the administrative side of the business with the same precision he'd tried to teach her. "Morning, Mike," Ruby called out, emerging from the parts room with a clipboard. "That custom order for Mr. Rodriguez's vintage Mustang came in, and Judge Hamilton's been calling about his Mercedes again." Mike nodded, hanging his worn leather jacket on the hook by his office door. Some people might have wondered why a former elite operator ended up running a small-town garage, but for Mike, working with engines brought a kind of peace he'd never found anywhere else. The morning proceeded with its usual rhythm until the distinct rumble of high-performance engines disturbed the quiet. Mike's combat-honed instincts noted the sound pattern. Multiple vehicles, moving in formation, modified exhausts meant for show rather than function. Ruby tensed slightly, moving toward the front of the shop. "The Oakwood crew," she said quietly. "They've been showing up all over Cedar Heights lately." Mike watched through the reflection in a toolbox as 3 expensive sports cars pulled into his lot, a Ferrari, a Porsche, and a modified BMW. The vehicles probably cost more than his entire business, but there was nothing impressive about the young men who emerged from them. The leader, a tall youth with perfectly styled hair and designer clothes that had never seen a day of real work, sauntered toward the entrance. "Third business this week," Ruby murmured, pretending to organize some repair orders. The Peterson family's deli and Westside Tires both had visits. Neither one's talking about what happened. Mike's expression remained neutral, but his mind was already calculating angles, distances, potential threats, habits that had kept him and his unit alive in some of the world's most dangerous places. "Go check the diagnostic computer in the back," he said quietly to Ruby. "I'm not leaving you out here alone," she protested, but his tone made it clear this wasn't a request. The bell above the door chimed as 3 of the young men entered, their expensive shoes clicking against the concrete floor. Mike continued, working on an engine, his movements unhurried and deliberate. "Nice little shop you've got here," the leader said, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone who'd never heard the word no in his life. Looking at his employee badge, Mike read the name Blake Reynolds III, son of the city's most prominent real estate developer. Blake ran his manicured fingers along a restored classic car waiting for pickup, his touch possessive and invasive. "Word is you're the man to talk to about performance modifications, custom work, special projects." Mike set down his wrench carefully, turning to face the young man with the steady gaze of someone who'd faced far worse threats. "Everything I do here is legal and documented. No street racing mods, no emission defeats." Blake smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. That's not exactly what we had in mind. See, Cedar Heights is changing. New development coming in. Way we see it, you could use some protection. Insurance, if you catch my meaning. In the back room, Ruby had her phone out, thumb hovering over Police Chief Martinez's number as she watched the confrontation unfold through the partially open door. Mike stepped away from the engine he'd been working on, wiping his hands methodically on a shop rag. Despite his simple work clothes and grease-stained hands, he carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a professional operator. "I appreciate the offer, but I've got all the insurance I need." Blake's smile vanished. "Might want to reconsider that, old man. Accidents happen. Would be a shame if something happened to this nice shop of yours. All these expensive cars, all this equipment. Fire hazard, you know." "That sounds an awful lot like a threat," Mike said, his voice carrying the same calm tone he'd used directing. "Combat operations in denied territory." "Just stating facts," Blake replied, examining his expensive watch with exaggerated casualness. "Think it over. We'll be back tomorrow for your answer. Oh, and that pretty Asian girl in the back? Make sure she understands how important it is that everyone in the neighborhood gets with the program." Mike took one step forward, and something in his movement made all three young men instinctively back up. "Let me be clear," he said quietly. "The shop is off limits. Ruby is off limits. You want to threaten someone, you deal with me directly." One of Blake's friends, wearing a Letterman jacket from the prestigious Oakwood Academy, reached into his pocket, but Blake stopped him with a subtle gesture. "Have it your way, grease monkey. But remember, we gave you a chance to do this the easy way." After they left, Ruby emerged from the back room. "I should have called the chief." Mike shook his head, watching through the window as the expensive cars roared away. "Not yet. Martinez has his hands full, and this isn't over." "What are you thinking?" Ruby asked, recognizing the look in his eyes. Mike's gaze remained fixed on the disappearing vehicles, his expression thoughtful. "I'm thinking it's time to make a phone call. One I should have made when these kids first started showing up in the neighborhood." The sun climbed higher over Cedar Springs, casting shorter shadows across the worn concrete of Thorne's auto service. The photographs in Mike's office, carefully curated glimpses of his past life, looked down from their places on the wall, silent witnesses to the gathering storm. The peace of the morning had been broken, and with it, the illusion that this quiet Colorado neighborhood could remain untouched by the darkness that had been growing on its edges. Mike reached for his phone, scrolling through contacts he hadn't called in years. Names and faces flashed through his memory. Men he'd fought beside, bled beside, nearly died beside. One number in particular made him pause. Colonel James Reaper Richardson. "You sure about this?" Ruby asked, recognizing the look in his eyes. "No," Mike admitted, "but I'm sure about one thing. What's coming next is going to change everything." The afternoon brought Mike's regular customers to Thorne's auto service, drawn by years of trust and the weight of recent events. Ray Martinez, the local mechanic instructor at the community college, arrived first, his Vietnam veteran cap worn proudly despite its fading. Maria Rodriguez from the family-owned bakery across the street brought coffee and concern. By closing time, the garage had become an informal gathering point for neighborhood discussion. "They hit Martinez tiers last night," Ray reported, leaning against a workbench while Mike worked on Chief Martinez's patrol car. "Broke every window. Carlos is considering their offer now." Mike continued his methodical work on the engine, his movements precise and controlled. "How many businesses have they approached?" "8 that we know of," Maria said, her face tight with worry. "My bakery's probably next. They're working their way through Cedar Heights systematically." Ruby emerged from the office with her laptop, her expression grim. "It's not just here. I've been making calls. The Reynolds Development Group has taken over 3 small neighborhoods in the last year. They follow the same pattern. Start with intimidation, escalate to vandalism, then bring in their own businesses once the original. Owners are forced out. The mention of systematic takeovers triggered something in Mike's memory. Another time, another place. He was back in Afghanistan, leading his unit through a mountain pass. They'd discovered a pattern of local businesses being systematically pressured, which led them to uncover a major corruption network. The past overlapped with the present, and he saw the same patterns emerging. They're not just taking over businesses, Mike said slowly, straightening up from the engine. They're establishing control. Cedar Heights' location makes it perfect. Close enough to downtown for luxury development, far enough out to operate without scrutiny. A sharp crack from outside made everyone jump. Through the window, they saw the 3 sports cars speeding away, the garage's front window now sporting a spiderweb of cracks from a thrown rock. Just the beginning, Ray muttered darkly. They're sending a message. Mike picked up his phone, scrolling to Colonel Richardson's number. The others fell silent as he dialed, respect and anticipation hanging heavy in the air. The colonel answered on the 3rd ring. Thorne, been a while. Too long, Reaper. We've got a situation in Cedar Heights, bad one. Remember Kandahar, pattern recognition. There was a pause on the line. Everyone in the garage could hear the gravity in Richardson's voice when he responded. How many? Started with 3. Intelligence suggests more behind them. They're organized, Reaper. Professional operation hidden behind privileged kids. Your shop still in the same place? Hasn't moved in 15 years. Keep your head down. I'll make some calls. After Mike hung up, Ruby approached with a fresh stack of papers. While you were on the phone, I got more information. The Reynolds Development Group isn't just about real estate. Look at this. The papers showed news reports from other neighborhoods, police bulletins, and business closure records. A pattern emerged that made Mike's combat instincts surge with recognition. They're expanding, Maria observed, looking over the documents. Getting more aggressive. Ray studied the map Ruby had marked with affected properties. But why Cedar Heights? Why now? Mike traced the development pattern with a practiced eye. Because we're the missing piece. Take Cedar Heights. They control the entire corridor between downtown and the new tech district. We're not just fighting for our businesses. We're fighting to keep this neighborhood from becoming another overpriced wasteland. The bell above the door chimed as Chief Martinez entered, his uniform dusty from a long day. Thought I'd find you all here. Just got word the Reynolds Group is bringing in more muscle. At least a dozen new security contractors spotted at their office. Blake's making his play, Mike said grimly. He's not waiting for answers. Ruby's phone buzzed with a text. Her face paled as she read it. Carlos from Martinez Tires just gave in. They're installing their own people tomorrow. The setting sun cast long shadows through the cracked window, turning the spiderweb pattern into something ominous. Mike looked at the faces around him. Friends, neighbors, community members. Each one carried their own struggles, their own fears, but now they faced a common threat. Reaper won't be here in time, Ray said, voicing what everyone was thinking. No, Mike agreed, but we're not starting from scratch. Everyone in this room has faced tough odds before. Maria straightened her shoulders, her posture showing traces of her years as a community organizer. What's the play? First, we document everything. Ruby, keep digging. Chief, we'll need you to look the other way sometimes, but be ready when we call. Ray, reach out to your contacts at the college. Start asking questions about the Reynolds family's previous developments. Maria, your bakery stays neutral ground. Keep listening. And you? Ruby asked, knowing that look in her mentor's eyes. I'm going to give Blake exactly what he's asking for, a meeting, but not the one he expects. As the group dispersed into the gathering darkness, Mike remained in his shop, the photographs on his walls seeming to watch him with particular intensity. Among them was a faded picture of his old unit, younger versions of themselves standing in the Afghan mountains, unaware of the paths their lives would take. His phone buzzed with a text from Richardson. Assets moving. Hold position. Watch your six. Outside, more high-performance engines rumbled past the garage, the drivers taking note of the cracked window. They thought they were sending a message of intimidation. Instead, they'd awakened something far more dangerous. They'd roused a quiet professional, a man who'd learned his trade in the hardest school of all. Mike moved through his closing routine with practiced efficiency, his mind already planning moves and counter-moves. Blake Reynolds and his crew thought they were dealing with a simple mechanic in a neighborhood they wanted to gentrify. They were about to learn a costly lesson about appearances and about the true meaning of community. Dawn broke over Cedar Heights with the roar of exotic engines. 6 high-performance cars tore down Maple Street in perfect formation, their modified exhausts shattering the morning peace. Mike Thorne watched from his garage window as they circled the neighborhood 3 times before parking in front of the, abandoned community center. Ruby arrived early, her face tight with concern. "They're not even trying to hide anymore," she reported, setting down 2 cups of coffee from Maria's bakery. "They've set up some kind of base in the community center." "Good," Mike replied, surprising her. "Let them show their hand." The morning light revealed fresh graffiti on several storefronts, stylized R symbols marking territory claimed for Reynolds' development. Chief Martinez's patrol car rolled past slowly, the veteran cop's face unreadable as he surveyed the damage. Inside the garage, Mike's phone buzzed with a text from Blake. "Meeting, noon, Rodriguez Bakery, come alone." "It's a trap," Ruby protested. When Mike showed her the message, "Of course it is. That's why I'm going." Mike checked his watch. "But first, show me what else you found." Ruby spread newspaper clippings and printouts across the hood of a customer's car. 3 neighborhoods in Denver, 2 in Colorado Springs. The Reynolds Group moves in fast, establishes control through intimidation, then starts buying up properties at pennies on the dollar. But here's the interesting part. They're not just developing luxury condos. They're taking over specific types of businesses, using them as fronts. Mike studied the pattern, his military training picking out the strategic elements. They're building infrastructure, legitimate cover for something bigger. The bell above the door chimed as Chief Martinez entered, carefully closing the door behind him. "Thought you should know. Got a call from the state police. They're getting pressure to back off any Reynolds investigations. Someone's got juice. In high places." "Figured as much," Mike nodded. "How's Carlos doing?" "Martinez Tires is already changing hands. Reynolds' people are in there now, but Carlos slipped me something interesting." Martinez pulled out his phone, showing them photos. They're modifying vehicles, hidden compartments, reinforced suspensions, custom electronics. Using the garage as a distribution point, Mike concluded. Ruby's research painted a darker picture. It's not just Martinez Tires. In other neighborhoods, they've taken over repair shops, car washes, storage facilities. They're building a whole network. As noon approached, Mike made his preparations. He knew Blake's crew would be watching, so he made no effort to hide his movements as he walked to Rodriguez Bakery. What they couldn't see was the modified phone in his pocket, running surveillance detection software developed by his old unit. The bakery was mostly empty when Mike entered. Maria gave him a slight nod from behind the counter, her movements deliberately casual. Blake occupied a corner booth, flanked by 2 older men in expensive suits who looked nothing like high school. "Students, glad you could make it." Blake gestured to the seat across from him. "Coffee? Let's skip the pleasantries." Mike settled into the booth, noting the barely concealed shoulder holsters under the suit's expensive jackets. "Straight to business. I respect that." Blake's attitude had shifted, showing hints of the operation hidden behind his spoiled, rich kid facade. "Here's the deal. Cedar Heights is changing. Old neighborhoods like this, they're dying. We're offering opportunity, development, progress. Through fear and intimidation? Through strength," Blake corrected, his facade cracking slightly to reveal something harder underneath. "The weak make way for the strong. That's business." Mike's voice remained steady. "And those who don't make way?" One of the suited men leaned forward. Then tomorrow morning there won't be a garage. Maybe not even a Thorne. Accidents happen, especially to stubborn mechanics who don't know their place. Mike took a slow sip of coffee, his mind recording every detail. Maria at the counter, pretending not to listen. 2 more suits by the door, hands near their jackets. The barely concealed earpieces they wore. The professional way they positioned themselves for optimal coverage. "You're right about one thing," Mike finally said. "Strong leadership does build communities. But real strength isn't about fear. It's about protecting people, serving something bigger than yourself." "Big words from a grease monkey," Blake sneered, but there was uncertainty in his eyes now. Something about Mike's demeanor was setting off warning bells. "Times have changed. Your kind of thinking is obsolete. Maybe, maybe not, but you've made 2 serious mistakes." Mike stood slowly, his movement causing both suited men to tense visibly. "First, you assumed that because I work with my hands, I'm weak. Second, you thought you could threaten my people without consequences. Is that a threat?" "No. It's a warning." Outside, more performance cars rumbled past the bakery. Blake's smile widened. "Sounds like more of my friends arriving." "How many friends do you have, old man?" "Enough." Mike turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. Next time you send someone to watch my garage at night, make sure they know how to spot military-grade surveillance equipment." Your boy got sloppy. The revelation that their surveillance had been detected caused a ripple of tension among Blake's professional backup. Their hands moved fractionally closer to their concealed weapons. As Mike walked back to his garage, he counted 4 more groups of expensive cars entering the neighborhood. The Reynolds group was building their force, preparing for a show of strength. Let them come. They hadn't yet realized that while they were watching him, he'd been gathering intelligence on their entire operation. His phone vibrated with a message from Colonel Richardson. "First team arriving tonight, Friday, and hammer inbound." The old guard was assembling. Ruby met him at the garage entrance. "How'd it go?" "About as expected. They're planning something. Big soon." He described the suited men's reactions. "But they're not as unified as they want us to think. Some of their people are having doubts. We can use that." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Cedar Heights as more Reynolds security teams arrived. They thought they were witnessing the quiet submission of another neighborhood. Instead, they were about to experience something far more dangerous, the awakening of a brotherhood forged in combat, tempered by sacrifice, and bound by something stronger than fear. Night settled over Cedar Heights like a heavy blanket, broken only by the scattered headlights of expensive cars patrolling the streets. Ruby worked late at the garage, organizing evidence that might reveal more about the Reynolds operation in other neighborhoods. The sound of an approaching vehicle made her freeze. Through the window, she saw one of Blake's friends, Kevin, pulling up in his Porsche alone. Before he could reach the entrance, 2 black SUVs appeared from the shadows. "Checking up on our friend?" one of Blake's security team asked, his tone threatening. Kevin straightened, trying to project confidence. Sure they're not planning anything stupid." "Funny. Blake was wondering the same thing about you." Ruby ducked behind a toolbox, phone ready to call Mike, who had left an hour earlier for a meeting with Chief Martinez. The conversation outside grew heated, but was suddenly interrupted by the distant sound of approaching vehicles. Not sports cars, but powerful engines moving with purpose. 2 blacked-out Ford Raptors rolled down Maple Street, their arrival causing Blake's security team to scatter. The driver of the first truck stepped out, a lean, weathered man in his 60s wearing a faded Special Forces cap. From the second vehicle emerged a mountain of a man carrying what looked like climbing gear. Ruby recognized them from the photos in Mike's office. James Friday, Wilson and Marcus Hammer Thompson, members of Mike's former unit. "Place looks about the same," Friday said, surveying the street with the practiced eye of a former sniper. "Except for the welcoming committee. They're watching from the coffee shop roof, Hammer noted casually, retrieving more equipment from his truck. 2 more in the alley by the hardware store. Ruby opened the garage's door. Mr. Wilson, Mr. Thompson, Mike's expecting you. Just Friday and Hammer, honey. We're not much for formalities. Inside, Friday immediately began a perimeter check, while Hammer set up what looked like climbing gear, but included sophisticated surveillance equipment. They moved with the coordinated efficiency of men who'd worked together for decades. Mike's got you staying at Maria's place above the bakery? Ruby asked. Good sight lines of the whole neighborhood, Friday approved, checking angles through the windows. Smart choice, Hammer added, setting up what appeared to be a normal radio, but bristled with modern modifications. Ruby's phone buzzed with a text from Maria. Reynolds security moving on Martinez tires. Looks ugly. Friday checked his watch. Right on schedule. They'll try to make an example tonight. Shouldn't we do something? Ruby asked. We are, Hammer replied, adjusting what appeared to be climbing anchors but contained signal monitoring equipment. First rule of counter-surveillance. Let them think they're in control. In the night air, the sound of breaking glass echoed from Martinez tires. Friday's expression hardened. They're sending a message, establishing dominance. Carlos knew this was coming, Hammer added, calibrating his equipment. Mike made sure. He was out of town tonight. Ruby watched as the 2 veterans continued their preparations, their calm efficiency both reassuring and slightly unnerving. These weren't just old soldiers. They were skilled operators who'd never really stopped being warriors. Company, Friday announced softly. Through the window, they saw Blake leading a group of cars toward the garage, clearly interested in the new arrivals. The bell chimed as Blake entered alone, his confidence masking unease. Friday and Hammer appeared to be simply unloading equipment, their lethal capabilities carefully concealed. Shop's closed, Ruby stated firmly. Just being neighborly. Blake smiled coldly. Noticed some new faces in town. Thought I'd introduce myself. Nothing new here, Friday replied without looking up. Just some old-timers helping a friend with inventory. Lot of that going around lately, Blake observed. Almost like Thorne's building his own little army. Hammer's laugh held no humor. Army, son? We're just retired folks with bad knees and worse attitudes. Nothing for you to worry about. Blake's eyes narrowed at being called son. Word of advice. Cedar Heights is changing. Might want to reconsider which side you're on. Already did that math. Friday finally turned to face him. Numbers came up pretty clear. The tension in the room could have been cut with a knife. Blake looked from Friday to Hammer, recognizing something in their bearing that gave him pause. These weren't ordinary veterans. The sudden crackle of radio traffic from outside drew Blake's attention. More trouble at Martinez tires. With a final warning look, he left to deal with the situation. As soon as he was gone, Friday and Hammer's casual demeanor vanished. They moved with focused purpose, setting up surveillance equipment disguised as automotive tools and supplies. He's got at least 20 security contractors in the neighborhood now, Friday reported, checking sight lines through a modified scope. More arriving hourly. They'll hit this place soon, Hammer added, unpacking what looked like mechanical tools but contained sophisticated monitoring devices. Probably tonight. Ruby's phone buzzed, a text from Mike. Situation at Martinez Tires handled. Chief, Martinez documenting everything. On my way back. Your friend's good at this, Friday commented, adjusting a concealed sensor. Always was. Knew exactly how to set the board before the game really started. What game is that? Ruby asked. Chess, Hammer replied, checking a tool bag that concealed communications gear. Right now everyone thinks this is about real estate, about control through intimidation. But Mike's playing a longer game. The sound of more high-performance engines filled the night as Reynolds' security continued to arrive. Friday watched them, through his scope, memorizing faces and formations. They think they're getting ready for a show of force, he observed. Don't realize they're being herded. Herded? Ruby asked. Into position, Hammer explained, the same way they used to set up operations in Iraq. Let the enemy think they're running the show while you're actually building a trap. Friday finished his sentence, and these boys just rode right into one. The night deepened over Cedar Heights, filled with the sound of engines and breaking glass. The Reynolds group thought they were demonstrating their power, establishing their dominance. They didn't realize that every move they made was being watched, recorded, and factored into a plan decades in the making. Mike Thorne's war wasn't just about saving his garage or even his neighborhood. It was about showing a new generation the true meaning of strength, honor, and community. The pieces were being set, the players were taking their positions, and the real battle was about to begin. Mike returned to find his garage transformed. What looked like simple equipment reorganization to untrained eyes was actually a sophisticated command center. Friday had established surveillance points throughout the building, while Hammer's climbing gear concealed enough communications equipment to coordinate a small unit. Just like old times, Mike observed, noting the familiar efficiency of his former teammates. Minus the mountain passes and mortar fire, Hammer grinned, adjusting what appeared to be a climbing harness but contained high-end monitoring equipment. "Your friends have been busy," Ruby noted. "Counted 23 Reynolds security contractors in the neighborhood now." 28, Friday corrected from his position near the window. 5 more arrived while you were meeting with the chief. They're setting up at the community center. Perfect. Mike smiled slightly. Everything's in position. Lauren emerged from the back office with a stack of documents. Found something interesting in the city records. The Reynolds group didn't choose Cedar Heights by accident. Someone's been preparing for their arrival. Buying key properties, changing zoning laws. "How high does it go?" Mike asked. "County level at least, maybe state." She spread papers across the workbench. "Look at these property transfers, all through shell companies, all connected to known Reynolds operations in other neighborhoods." Their discussion was interrupted by the roar of engines. A large group of cars circled the garage, revving modified exhausts in an obvious show of intimidation. Blake led them, accompanied by several unfamiliar faces, harder-looking men wearing expensive suits rather than designer casual wear. "They're not just bringing in muscle," Friday observed through his scope. "Those new guys are professionals, former military contractors based on their movement patterns." Mike watched as the security teams established positions around the garage. "They're setting up a kill zone. Standard infantry tactics. Smart." Hammer nodded. "But predictable." The bell chimed as Kevin entered alone, his hands carefully visible. Friday's rifle remained trained on him from a concealed position, but Mike noticed something in the young man's demeanor. Tension, uncertainty. "Blake sent me with a message," Kevin began, then hesitated. His eyes moved to the military photos on the wall, lingering on one in particular. "Third group, Afghanistan," Mike confirmed, studying the younger man more carefully now. "You had family there. My brother, Rangers, never came home." Understanding passed between them, the weight of shared loss and battles fought far from home. "What's your real name, son?" Mike asked quietly. "Kevin Matthews." "Listen." Kevin glanced nervously at the window. "Blake doesn't know about my connection to the service, but things are changing. The new guys he's bringing in, they're not just security, they're something else." "We know," Friday spoke from his position, making Kevin start. "Former contractors, some with special operations background. Question is, why are you telling us?" Before Kevin could answer, Chief Martinez's cruiser pulled up outside. The Reynolds security teams parted reluctantly, their respect for law enforcement noticeably thin. The chief entered carrying a thick envelope. "Evening, gentlemen. Kevin." Martinez's use of Kevin's real name carried meaning. "Thought you should see these state police surveillance photos, officially misplaced from evidence." The photos showed Reynolds security members meeting with well-dressed men in expensive cars, money and packages changing hands, coordinates written on maps of the region. "They're not just taking over neighborhoods anymore," Martinez explained. "They're building an entire network. Drugs, Weapons, high-end car theft. Cedar Heights is meant to be their new hub because of the highway access. The industrial park, too, Ruby realized. All those empty warehouses. Kevin shifted uncomfortably. That's not all. Blake's bringing in some new partners tomorrow. Real heavy hitters, Russian connection. Mike exchanged looks with Friday and Hammer. The situation was escalating beyond a simple real estate grab. The Reynolds Group wasn't just threatening their neighborhood. They were threatening to turn it into a major criminal enterprise hub. Time to call in the rest of the old guard, Hammer suggested. Mike nodded, but his eyes were on Kevin. You're taking an awful risk coming here. Maybe, Kevin admitted. But my brother died wearing a flag on his shoulder. What these guys are planning, it ain't right. Outside, more cars arrived, the Reynolds show of force growing by the hour. But now Mike's team had something they hadn't before. Inside intelligence. Chief. Mike turned to Martinez. How many of your officers can we trust? 4, maybe 5. Reynolds has hooks in the department already. Friday appeared beside them, his movements silent despite his age. Colonel's called in some markers. We've got more friends arriving tomorrow, people who know how to handle this kind of situation. Ruby's phone buzzed with an alert. Her face paled as she read it. They're moving on Carlos's garage now. Security. Cameras just went dark. Right on schedule, Mike said calmly. Friday, the former sniper, was already moving. Hammer and I planted some surprises earlier. Nothing lethal, just informative. Kevin looked confused. What do you mean? He means, Hammer smiled grimly, that while Reynolds' crew has been putting on their show out here, we've been setting up our own performance. Mike's phone lit up with a message from Colonel Richardson. Package delivered. Operation Greenlight. Engineers arriving at dawn. The night air carried the sound of more high-performance engines, but now there was something else. The distant rumble of heavy trucks moving on the outskirts of the neighborhood. The Reynolds Group thought they were tightening their grip on Cedar Heights. Instead, they were about to learn a harsh lesson about the difference between showing force and truly wielding it. Better get back, Mike told Kevin. They'll be looking for you soon. As the young man left, Lauren watched him go with concern. Can we trust him? We don't have to, Friday answered, still monitoring the street activity through his custom optics. Man's conscience is doing our work for us. Outside, Blake's show of force continued, but Mike noticed something his former protege had missed. The Reynolds security team's intimidation tactics had just given them perfect cover to move their own pieces into position. Sometimes, he reflected, the best place to hide was in plain sight. Kevin's message had confirmed what they'd suspected. This wasn't about real estate anymore. The question wasn't whether they could trust him. The question was whether Reynolds' crew was ready for what was coming. A lesson in true strength taught by men who'd learned it the hard way in places far from home. Dawn arrived with the sound of heavy diesel engines. 3 unmarked Peterbilts rolled into Cedar Heights, their drivers navigating the neighborhood streets with military precision. The Reynolds security teams watched nervously as the vehicles disappeared behind Thorne's. Auto Service Engineering Corps, Friday explained to Ruby as they unloaded crates of seemingly innocent construction supplies. Best demo guys in Afghanistan. Now they build things instead of blowing them up. Usually. The engineers, 4 weathered men in their 60s, moved with practiced efficiency. What looked like renovation materials to casual observers were actually components of a sophisticated defensive network. Every crate, every box positioned with purpose. Across the neighborhood, Blake watched the activity from the Reynolds command post in the community center. A sleek black Mercedes pulled up. 2 well-dressed Russian men emerging with briefcases. Your territory is compromised, the older Russian stated without preamble. These veterans, they're not amateurs. We've got 30 contractors, Blake counted. They've got what, 10 old-timers? Numbers mean nothing against experience, the Russian's eyes narrowed. Our investment requires stability. Instead, we find chaos. Kevin stood at the back of the room, carefully maintaining his poker face while memorizing details. The Russian arrival confirmed the operation was bigger than anyone had suspected. Meanwhile, at the police station, Chief Martinez faced his own crisis. 3 of his deputies had been caught tampering with evidence related to Reynolds' activities. The chief's response was swift and final. "Turn in your badges," he ordered. "State police will want to talk to you about those missing surveillance photos." Back at Thorne's auto service, Mike's team worked systematically. The engineers had transformed the building's infrastructure, while Friday established a network of observation posts throughout the neighborhood. Hammer's climbing gear now included enough tactical equipment to support a small operation. "Blake's getting desperate," Ruby reported, hanging up her phone. "2 more businesses hit last night, but people are starting to push back. Your presence is giving them courage." "Courage isn't about fearlessness," Mike replied, echoing words he'd learned in combat. The conversation was interrupted by screeching tires. A Reynolds security vehicle cut off Ruby's car as she tried to leave for a supply run. 3 contractors surrounded her vehicle, their intentions clear. What happened next occurred with stunning speed. Friday's rifle cracked once, a precise shot that shattered the lead contractor's side mirror. Hammer appeared as if from nowhere, tactical gear in hand, but stance pure warrior. From the roof, 2 engineers set up positions with military efficiency. The Reynolds contractors found themselves caught in a perfectly executed crossfire. No shots fired, but the message was clear. Ruby was untouchable. "Next time," Friday's voice carried across the street, "I won't aim for the mirror." The contractors retreated, but the incident marked a turning point. Word spread through Cedar Heights. The old veterans weren't just talk. They could back it up. Blake received the news with cold fury. "Find out everything about Thorne's people, and bring me Kevin. Something's not right with him." But Kevin was already moving, using his position to gather intelligence. He found the evidence in Blake's office, detailed plans for turning Cedar Heights into a major distribution hub. The operation went beyond drugs and car theft. The Reynolds group was setting up trafficking routes. The discovery nearly made him sick. His brother had died fighting for something better than this. At Maria's bakery, Mike met with his team, including the newly arrived engineers. The restaurant had become their informal command center, with Maria keeping unwanted ears away. Russians changed everything, Friday reported. "This isn't just about territory anymore." "Never was," Mike corrected. "Territory was just their cover. They needed Cedar Heights infrastructure, the highway access, the industrial park, the remote locations. Chief Martinez joined them, looking tired but determined. Cleaned house at the department, got maybe 8 reliable officers now." "Enough." One of the engineers grunted. "Quality over quantity." Ruby spread out a map of the neighborhood, now marked with Reynolds' positions and activities. "They're still expanding, but looking closer at the pattern, they're boxing themselves in," Mike finished. "Every position they take, every show of force, they're following the path we laid out for them." "Speaking of paths," Hammer interjected, "our Russian friends made a mistake. Left a paper trail a mile wide." The chief smiled grimly. "State police would be very interested in that trail." "Not yet," Mike cautioned. "We need them fully committed first. No escape routes, no plausible deniability." Outside, more Reynolds security teams patrolled the streets, their presence projecting menace. But Mike's team saw something different: predictable patterns, exploitable weaknesses, the overconfidence that comes before a fall. The engineers had finished their work, transforming the garage and surrounding buildings into a hardened position that looked completely normal to untrained eyes. Friday's surveillance network provided total coverage of Reynolds' movements. Hammer's preparations ensured they could handle whatever came next. Mike's phone buzzed, a message from Colonel Richardson. "Final team inbound. Operation goes hot at midnight." Ruby looked at the veterans around her, seeing not old men but skilled operators preparing for battle. They still think they're dealing with a bunch of retired vets. That's their mistake, Friday replied softly. We never retired. We just found a different way to serve. The sun set over Cedar Heights, casting long shadows through streets now divided between two kinds of force. One built on fear and greed, the other forged in combat and tempered by time. The coming night would determine which was stronger, and the cost of learning that lesson would be high. Midnight brought a different kind of thunder to Cedar Heights. 3 black Chevy Suburbans rolled into the neighborhood, led by a midnight, blue Ford Raptor that longtime residents recognized as belonging to Colonel James Reaper Richardson. The Reynolds security teams tracked their progress, but didn't intervene. Something about the newcomers' arrival suggested confrontation would be unwise. Cutting it close, Mike greeted his former commander with a slight smile. Had to make some arrangements. Richardson's weathered face showed the miles he'd traveled, but his eyes were sharp as ever. DEA's standing by, but they'll hold position until we give the word. Inside Thorne's auto service, now a sophisticated command center hidden behind toolboxes and engine parts. The colonel surveyed his assembled team. The engineers had transformed the building while maintaining its innocent appearance. Friday's surveillance network provided real-time intelligence on Reynolds' movements. Hammer's tactical gear was ready for any contingency. Blake's meeting with his Russian friends right now, Ruby reported, monitoring communications. They're not happy about delays. Good, Richardson nodded. Pressure makes people sloppy. The night erupted with the roar of engines, dozens of them. The Reynolds group was mobilizing in force. Through Friday's surveillance feeds, they watched Blake addressing his gathered security teams. Tonight, we show these old-timers what real power looks like. Blake's voice crackled through their monitors. No more games, no more warnings. Here they come, Friday announced calmly. Count 40-plus vehicles moving in formation. They've got gun trucks behind them. Looks like serious hardware. Mike watched the approaching force with the detachment of a veteran commander. Right on schedule. Chief Martinez's voice came through. They're secure channel. My people are in position. Fire department standing by. But they're really your guys from Force Recon, kitted out as firefighters. The Reynolds group's approach was impressive. Vehicles moving in coordinated patterns, blocking every intersection around the garage. Blake had clearly studied military tactics. Unfortunately for him, he was using them against the men who'd written the book on such operations. Remember, Mike addressed his team, we're not here to fight them. We're here to show them what real strength looks like. The first attack came as expected, a brick through the garage's front window. But instead of shattering, the reinforced glass merely cracked in a spiderweb pattern. The engineers exchanged knowing looks. That's military-grade material, one explained to Ruby. Same stuff we used in embassy construction. Blake's voice boomed through a megaphone. Time's up, Thorne. This is your last chance to surrender the shop. Before Mike could respond, movement caught their attention. Kevin was approaching the garage alone, his hands raised. Behind him, several Reynolds security contractors watched with suspicion. No, Friday reported, tracking multiple laser dots appearing on Kevin's back. His cover's blown. Get him inside, Mike ordered. The engineers moved with practiced efficiency, covering Kevin's approach with concealed positions. Just as Kevin reached the garage's entrance, all hell broke loose. 3 Reynolds contractors opened fire, but their shots sparked harmlessly off hidden armor plating. The engineers' preparations proved their worth as the garage transformed from vulnerable target to hardened position. Now, Mike commanded quietly. Across Cedar Heights, synchronized actions commenced. The fire department's response blocked critical intersections. Police units appeared at strategic locations. Most surprisingly, dozens of local residents emerged. From businesses and homes, many of them veterans themselves, creating a second layer of resistance. What is this? Blake demanded, seeing his carefully planned assault disrupted by civilian interference. This is community, Mike's voice carried across the suddenly quiet street. Something you wouldn't understand. The Reynolds forces found themselves caught in carefully prepared zones of control. Every escape route was blocked, every tactical advantage nullified. Years of combat experience had gone into preparing this moment. "Your Russian friends are already gone," Richardson announced, through their own PA system. Seems they recognized a losing proposition. Through their surveillance, they watched the Russian representative's Mercedes speeding out of town, leaving Blake and his forces alone. "You think this changes anything?" Blake shouted, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "We still outnumber you!" "Numbers," Friday's quiet laugh carried across their comms. "Son, you brought a street gang to a special operations fight." As if to emphasize the point, hidden lights suddenly illuminated the entire block, eliminating shadows the Reynolds team had planned to use for cover. Every sniper position they'd selected was already occupied by veterans who'd learned their trade in real combat. "Last chance," Mike offered. "Surrender now, face regular charges. Continue, and we provide the DEA with everything we've gathered about your operation, including your Russian connection." Inside the garage, Kevin watched the scene unfold. He won't back down. His pride won't let him. "We're counting on that." Richardson smiled grimly. Blake's response came in the form of gunfire, wild, untrained shots that proved more dangerous to his own men than their targets. The veterans' positions held firm, their return fire precise and measured, disabling vehicles, without harming drivers. "Phase 2, Mike ordered calmly. Throughout Cedar Heights, coordinated actions began. Reynolds' security members found their vehicles mysteriously disabled. Escape routes disappeared, communications jammed, years of combat experience combined. With modern technology and local support created an invisible net drawing ever tighter. "Impressive setup," Richardson observed, "but you know he's got an ace in the hole. Men like Blake always keep one last card to play." "That's what we're counting on," Mike replied, watching as the Reynolds formation began to crack under pressure. "Sometimes you have to let the enemy think he's got one last chance before you spring the real trap." The night was far from over, and the real battle was just beginning. But already the Reynolds group was learning a harsh lesson about the difference between intimidation and true tactical superiority. They'd brought numbers and aggression to face off against something far more dangerous. Veterans who'd never forgotten their training, their brotherhood, or their duty to protect their community. Blake's laughter cut through the night, carrying an edge of dangerous confidence that made Mike's combat instincts surge. "You think we didn't plan for this? You think we came unprepared?" On cue, 3 armored SUVs emerged from the community center's parking garage. Professional contractors in tactical gear deployed with military precision, their weapons and movements marking them as former special operations operators. "Private military contractors," Friday reported from his observation post. "Blackwater alumni may be worse. These aren't weekend warriors." Ruby's voice came urgently through their comms. "Found something in their files. They're not just here for the garage. They've got a whole backup plan. Underground storage in the old maintenance tunnels. Escape routes through the industrial park." "Makes sense," Richardson nodded. "Never put all your resources in one location. Basic tactical doctrine." Inside Thorne's auto service, now a hardened command center, Mike watched the mercenaries establish firing positions. Their deployment was textbook perfect, which made them predictable. "Chief," Mike called over the secure channel. "Status on your end?" Martinez's response was grim. "Got 3 more officers I had to sideline. Reynolds had deeper hooks than we thought, but the ones we've got left are solid." The mercenaries' leader, a hard-faced man with a professional bearing, addressed them through a tactical megaphone. "This is your one warning. We are authorized to use lethal force. Clear the building now." "They're setting up a crossfire," Friday reported. "Classic kill zone. Except they don't know about the tunnels," one of the engineers finished with a slight smile. During their preparations, they'd discovered and modified Cedar Heights' forgotten network of maintenance tunnels and storm drains. Kevin studied the mercenaries through a reinforced window. "I recognize some of them. Ex-Delta Force. Couple of SEAL teams. Blake hired them through his Russian connections." "Good," Mike's response surprised them. Professional soldiers understand professional courtesy and consequences. As if proving his point, the mercenary leader deployed his men with strict fire discipline. No wild shots, no collateral damage. These men weren't thugs. They were hired guns who followed rules of engagement. Ruby's computer pinged with an alert. Got movement at the neighborhood limits. Reynolds' reinforcements trying to enter through the industrial park. Let them, Richardson ordered. That route's been prepared. Outside, the situation escalated as more Reynolds security arrived. But something was different. The locals weren't hiding anymore. Store owners stood in doorways, many of them veterans. Themselves. Lights came on in houses. People emerged onto porches. The neighborhood was awakening. Interesting, Hammer observed from his position. They're not just watching. They're choosing sides. The mercenary leader noticed it too, his hand pressed to his radio earpiece, clearly receiving updates about the changing situation. His expression showed the first hints of professional concern. Blake, however, remained oblivious to the subtle shift. "Light them up," he ordered. But the mercenaries didn't move. "We don't fire into civilian populations," the leader stated firmly. "That wasn't part of the contract." "I'm paying you to follow orders. You're paying us to secure a location," the mercenary corrected, "not to start a war with American veterans and civilians." Mike's voice carried across the tense standoff. "Check your phones." The mercenaries found messages waiting, detailed dossiers on their own backgrounds, families, and activities. Not a threat, but a reminder that they weren't the only professionals involved. "This is bigger than a garage," Mike continued. "Your employer is running drugs, weapons, and human trafficking. We've got proof. DEA is already moving on his operations in other neighborhoods. Choice is yours. Be on the right side of what's coming or go down with him." The mercenary leader studied the information on his phone, his professional mask cracking slightly. "Stand down," he ordered his men. "What?" Blake's voice cracked with rage. "I paid you to—" "You paid us to help secure territory," the leader cut him off. "Not to wage war on American soil against U.S. veterans. Contracts terminated." As the mercenaries began pulling back, Blake's control finally shattered. "Kill them all!" He screamed at his remaining followers, but his men hesitated, seeing their professional backup departing. "Now," Mike commanded quietly. Throughout Cedar Heights, coordinated actions began. Police units appeared at key intersections. Fire trucks, manned by disguised force recon veterans, blocked strategic routes. Most surprisingly, dozens of citizens emerged from their homes and businesses, many carrying legal firearms, forming a second line of defense. "This is what real strength looks like," Richardson commented. "Not fear, not intimidation, community." But Blake wasn't finished. His eyes had taken on a dangerous gleam. "Fine. If they won't do it, we'll handle it ourselves. Bring out the heavy gear." From the community center emerged something that made even the veterans pause. A converted armored truck, reinforced with steel plating and mounted weapons. Blake had saved his true surprise for last. "That's cartel equipment," Kevin reported, tensely. "Military-grade hardware smuggled up from Mexico. They've got enough firepower to level the whole block." Mike watched the armored vehicle approach, his expression unchanged. "Good thing we planned for that too." "We did?" Ruby asked. Friday's quiet laugh carried through their comms. "Honey, your uncle didn't just call in his old unit. He called in every favor we earned in 40 years of service. And believe me, that's quite a list." The night air filled with tension as Blake's final gambit rolled toward them, but Mike Thorne's team had faced worse odds in darker places. They'd learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the biggest battles aren't won with weapons, but with wisdom, patience, and the strength of a community united against fear. The armored truck rumbled toward Thorne's auto service like a metal beast, its mounted weapons gleaming under the streetlights. Blake stood through the top hatch, his face twisted with manic confidence. But Mike's team had served in places where such vehicles were common threats, and they'd learned how to deal with them. Now might be a good time for that surprise you. Mentioned, Ruby said, watching the approaching threat through reinforced windows. Wait for it. Friday replied calmly from his position. 3, 2, 1. The ground beneath the armored vehicle suddenly collapsed, one of the engineering team's hidden preparations. A carefully weakened section of street gave way, trapping the truck in a perfectly calculated pit. Amazing what you can do with old maintenance tunnel maps and some structural engineering, an engineer commented casually. Those underground passages aren't just for show. Blake's expression shifted from confidence to shock as his ultimate weapon became useless. But Mike's team wasn't finished. Throughout Cedar Heights, hidden preparations began activating. 40 years in construction taught us a few things. Another, engineer explained as mechanical whirs filled the air. Hidden barriers rose from seemingly normal streets, cutting off the Reynolds security team's escape routes. Storm drains suddenly sealed. Fire hydrants activated strategically, and pre-positioned equipment created instant roadblocks. They didn't just fortify the garage, Kevin realized, watching through the windows. They transformed the whole neighborhood into a defensive position. Ruby's computer chirped with an alert. She'd been digging through files gathered from Reynolds. Operations in other cities. Got something big, really big. Their entire network, shipping routes, corrupt officials, cartel connections, everything. Send copies to every federal agency, Richardson ordered. And to news outlets. Once this goes public, there's no putting it back in the box. Outside, the trapped armored vehicle's failure had sparked a change in the Reynolds security ranks. Veteran contractors, many of whom had served themselves, began backing away from Blake's position. His extreme tactics had crossed a line they weren't willing to follow. Your call, brothers, Kevin addressed them through their own radio frequency. Face federal charges for what we've already done, or help stop this madness, and maybe earn some consideration. Chief Martinez's voice crackled through the secure channel. State police are in position. DEA, too. They're waiting for our signal. Not yet, Mike cautioned. Let's see how many we can turn first. The night air crackled with tension, as more Reynolds security contractors began lowering their weapons. Blake's control was visibly slipping as his followers realized the full scope of what they were facing. This isn't just about one garage or one neighborhood anymore, Richardson announced through their PA system. Look around you. Look what your leadership's brought you to. Fighting American veterans, threatening civilians, running drugs through communities. Is this what you signed up for? His words struck home. Several contractors removed their tactical vests. Others simply stepped back, separating themselves from Blake's remaining loyalists. Cowards! Blake screamed from his trapped vehicle. Traitors! I'll kill every one of you! No, a rally voice responded. You won't. Maria emerged from her bakery, where she'd been coordinating civilian resistance. Behind her stood dozens of local veterans, men and women who'd served across generations, now united to protect their neighborhood. See, that's the difference between real strength and what you're selling, Maria continued. Real strength builds things, protects things. It doesn't destroy communities for profit. Ruby's voice came urgently through the comms. Multiple hits on the files we released. FBI is already moving on Reynolds operations in 3 states. DEA is hitting their supply lines. It's all coming down. Blake must have received similar news through his own channels. His face contorted with desperate rage as he reached for something in the armored truck. If I'm going down, I'm taking this whole damn neighborhood with me. Explosives in the community center, Kevin reported tensely. Enough to level 3 blocks. But Mike's team had planned for this too. Friday's rifle cracked. Once, a precise shot that knocked the detonator from Blake's hand. Before he could reach for it again, hidden sprinkler systems activated throughout the community center, soaking any explosives within. Did you really think we didn't check the building first? Hammer's voice carried across the street. Those explosives were disarmed hours ago. We just let you think you had an ace in the hole. Blake's remaining support crumbled as the truth became clear. They'd been outmaneuvered at every turn. What looked like a simple standoff had been an elaborate trap, months in the planning. Your choice, Mike addressed the remaining Reynolds contractors. Surrender now. Cooperate with authorities. Maybe salvage something from this. Or go down. With a leader who was willing to kill innocent civilians to protect his pride. The response came in waves. More tactical vests dropped, weapons lowered, men stepping away from Blake's position. Even his most loyal followers could see the writing on the wall. Chief Martinez's cruiser rolled forward, lights flashing. Last chance, Blake. Make it easy on yourself. But Blake's eyes had taken on a dangerous gleam. Easy? He laughed, the sound carrying an edge of madness. Nothing about this is going to be easy. In the command center, Mike watched his former adversary's deteriorating mental state with experienced eyes. Get ready, he warned his team. Wounded animals are the most dangerous. The night wasn't over yet. Despite their victories, despite turning most of his men, despite trapping his secret weapon, Blake wasn't finished. The real question was how many people he was willing to take down with him in his final act of desperation. "Incoming!" Friday reported suddenly. "Multiple vehicles moving fast! Not law enforcement!" Ruby checked their surveillance feeds. "More contractors?" "No," Mike corrected grimly. "Not backup, cleanup. The Russians don't leave loose ends." The situation had just become even more complicated. Now they weren't just fighting to save their neighborhood. They were fighting to prevent a bloodbath. The Russian vehicles entered Cedar Heights like predators. Black Mercedes SUVs with tinted windows and reinforced frames. Their approach was professional, methodical, nothing like the Reynolds security team's shows of force. These were trained killers who understood urban warfare. 4 vehicles, 3 shooters each, Friday reported from his position. Russian Spetsnaz, training based on their movement patterns. "They're not here to negotiate," Richardson added grimly. "They're here to eliminate witnesses and evidence." Blake's face showed the dawning realization that he'd been betrayed. His partners had decided he was now a liability to be removed rather than an asset to be saved. "Lauren," Mike called through their comms, "execute Protection Protocol Alpha. Get the civilians clear." Throughout Cedar Heights, pre-planned evacuation procedures began. Maria's Bakery became a gathering point, with the veteran-staffed fire department coordinating movement of neighborhood residents to secure locations. "This changes things," Chief Martinez stated, watching the Russian teams deploy with military precision. "These aren't contractors we can arrest. These are professional killers." "All right then," Richardson replied. "It's a good thing you've got professional soldiers to deal with them." The Russian teams split into tactical formations, moving to surround both the garage and the trapped Reynolds contractors. Their intent was clear: no witnesses, no loose ends. Friday's warning came just as the first shots cracked through the night. The Russian teams had opened up with suppressed weapons, aiming to eliminate the Reynolds contractors first. Mike's veterans responded with the coordination that comes from years of combat experience. The engineers' preparations proved their worth, as hidden defensive positions activated. Friday's precision fire kept the Russian teams from gaining advantageous positions. "They're trying to herd everyone into a kill zone," Kevin observed, his military training showing through his civilian exterior. "Not trying," Mike corrected. "Succeeding. Except that's exactly what we want." The Russian teams pressed their advantage, forcing Reynolds contractors to seek cover near Thorne's auto service. What looked like tactical success was actually playing directly into the veterans' strategy. "Now," Mike ordered quietly. Throughout the area, synchronized actions began. Fire sprinklers activated strategically, creating zones of limited visibility. Hidden lights illuminated some sectors while plunging others into darkness, disrupting the Russian team's night vision equipment. The engineers' modifications to the streets and buildings turned familiar terrain into a tactical nightmare for the attackers. "They're professionals," Hammer commented, monitoring the situation. "But we've been preparing this battleground for months." Blake, trapped in his disabled armored vehicle, watched in disbelief as his former allies tried to gun down his men. Something broke in him, not towards madness, but towards clarity. "Brotherhood!" he called out to his remaining contractors. "Form up! Protect the civilians!" It was the first good order he'd given all night. Reynolds' security members, many of them veterans themselves, moved to help evacuate residents caught in the crossfire. They became part of the solution rather than part of the problem. Chief Martinez coordinated with his remaining trusted officers, establishing a perimeter to keep the fighting contained. "State police are 20 minutes out. We'll be done in 10, Richardson assured him. The Russian teams found themselves caught in an elaborate trap. Every move they made had been anticipated, every tactical option counter-planned. They were fighting men who'd learned their trade in the harshest conditions imaginable and had spent decades refining those skills. "Southeast team is pulling back," Friday reported. "They recognize what's happening." "Let them retreat," Mike ordered. "We want witnesses to carry the message. Some neighborhoods aren't worth targeting." Ruby's voice came through their comms. "Civilians are clear. FBI's got our evidence packages. DEA is moving on Russian locations in 3 states. The entire network is exposed. The Russian teams began a fighting retreat, their professional discipline showing in their coordinated withdrawal. They'd come expecting to eliminate some contractors and witnesses. Instead, they'd run into a prepared force of combat veterans who'd turned the entire neighborhood into a defensive position. "They're bugging out," Friday confirmed. "Taking their wounded but leaving their equipment." "Document everything," Richardson ordered. "Shell casings, vehicle tracks, equipment serial numbers. Build the case." As the sound of gunfire faded, a new noise filled the night. Sirens approaching from multiple directions. State police, FBI, DEA. The cavalry was finally arriving, but the neighborhood had already saved itself. Blake emerged from his trapped vehicle, his former arrogance replaced by a mix of shock and realization. "You could have eliminated us at any time," he said to Mike. "Why didn't you?" "Because this wasn't about eliminating anyone," Mike replied. "It was about showing a different kind of strength, one based on protecting people, not terrorizing them." Reynolds' contractors, who'd helped protect civilians, stood alongside local veterans, the lines between them blurring. They'd come to Cedar Heights, looking for power through fear. Instead, they'd found a lesson in real strength, real brotherhood. Chief Martinez approached, holstering his weapon. "Got a choice to make," he told Blake. "Cooperate, help us shut down the Russian operations, maybe find some redemption, or go down with them." The night's events had shattered more than just the Reynolds Group's control of Cedar Heights. They'd shattered the illusion that strength comes from intimidation rather than community, from fear rather than respect. "This isn't over," Richardson warned as federal agents began arriving. "The Russians won't take this loss lightly." "No," Mike agreed, watching as his neighborhood began to emerge from its defensive positions. "But now they know what they're dealing with, and so does everyone else. The sun would soon rise on a changed Cedar Heights." The battle had been won not just by tactical superiority or military experience, but by something more powerful, a community's refusal to be intimidated and the unbreakable bonds of true brotherhood. Dawn painted neighborhood streets in shades of gold, highlighting bullet holes and scattered debris from the night's conflict. Federal agents swarmed the area, processing evidence and taking statements, but Mike's team knew this was just the beginning. "Russians already making moves," Ruby reported, monitoring communications from their command center. "They're legitimate. Businesses are canceling contracts with local companies. They're trying to economically isolate the neighborhood." "Standard tactics," Richardson nodded. "Soften up the target before the real attack." Friday appeared silently, as was his habit. "Got movement in 3 neighboring districts. Russians shifting assets, calling in specialists. This isn't over." Mike watched as FBI agents interviewed former Reynolds contractors. Blake sat with DEA investigators, his former bravado replaced by grim determination as he detailed the Russian operations. Outside, Chief Martinez managed the complex dance of multiple agencies claiming jurisdiction. "They're trying to help," Hammer observed, watching the federal response, "but they don't understand what they're really dealing with." No, Mike agreed. They think this is about drugs and crime. They don't see the bigger picture. Ruby's computer pinged with new information. Got something. Russians aren't just about drugs. They've got legitimate corporations, political connections. Look at these campaign contributions. The evidence painted a disturbing picture. The Russians had spent years building a network of influence through seemingly legitimate businesses and political donations. Cedar Heights wasn't just a distribution hub. It was a test case for their larger strategy. If they can take a neighborhood like this, Richardson realized, they can take anywhere. Kevin, now working openly with Mike's team, brought more news. Reynolds' security teams in other cities are falling apart. What happened here? It's spreading. Guys are choosing sides. The morning light revealed more of the engineers' preparations. The neighborhood hadn't just been fortified. It had been transformed into an integrated defensive position. Federal agents studied the modifications with professional interest. Sir, a young FBI agent approached Mike. We've got a problem. Some of these Russian connections, they go pretty high up. We're getting pressure to minimize the investigation. Expected that, Mike replied calmly. That's why we documented everything and sent copies to multiple agencies and news outlets. Can't bury what's already public. Inside Maria's bakery, now serving as an impromptu command post, Blake sat with Mike and Richardson. The former Reynolds leader had aged years overnight. I never saw the whole picture, he admitted. Thought we were building something. Didn't realize we were just their pawns. Now's your chance to make it right, Richardson responded. But it'll cost you. Already has. Blake looked out at his former men, now cooperating with authorities. Question is, what's the play now? Russians won't let this go. No, Mike agreed. They can't. We've exposed too much of their operation. They'll have to respond hard, make an example. Ruby brought in more surveillance data. Russian-owned businesses throughout the region were showing unusual activity. Private jets landing at small airports, unmarked trucks moving at night, money flowing through hidden accounts. They're not just sending killers this time, Friday analyzed the patterns. They're mobilizing everything they've got. Professional mercenaries, corrupt officials, economic warfare. Good, Mike's response surprised them. How is that good? Blake asked. Because they're angry. When people are angry, they make mistakes, and we've been planning for their mistakes. Chief Martinez joined them, looking tired but determined. State. Police are pulling back. Political pressure. We're on our own. Not quite. Richardson smiled slightly. Made some calls, got some friends in interesting places. People who understand what's really at stake here. Outside, more contractors arrived, but not to cause trouble. These were veterans from other security companies, drawn by word of what had happened in Cedar Heights. They came to stand with their brothers against a greater threat. Russians are watching all this, Friday reported. They're seeing their intimidation tactics backfire, bringing people together instead of tearing them apart. That's what they never understood, Mike said quietly. Real strength isn't about fear or money. It's about community, about standing together. Ruby's computer chirped again. Got movement, big movement. Private military contractors being hired through shell companies, weapons being moved through seemingly legitimate shipping companies. They're going to hit us with everything. Let them. Come. Richardson's voice carried absolute confidence. We've got something they don't understand, something they can't fight. What's that? Blake asked. A cause worth fighting for. And men who've spent their lives learning how to fight for it. The morning sun climbed higher over Cedar Heights, revealing a neighborhood transformed not just physically, but spiritually. The battle had forged new alliances, strengthened old bonds, and reminded everyone of what real brotherhood meant. But darker clouds were gathering on the horizon. The Russians were mobilizing forces that would dwarf their previous attempt. They weren't just trying to silence witnesses anymore. They were fighting to preserve their entire operation. Mike Thorne and his veterans had won the first round, but the real war was just beginning. The only question was whether the price of victory would be worth the cost of the fight. "What is this?" Blake demanded, seeing his carefully planned assault disrupted by civilian interference. "This is community," Mike's voice carried across the suddenly quiet street. "Something you wouldn't understand. The Reynolds forces found themselves caught in carefully prepared zones of control. Every escape route was blocked, every tactical advantage nullified. Years of combat experience had gone into preparing this moment. Your Russian friends are already gone," Richardson announced, through their own PA system. Seems they recognized a losing proposition. Through their surveillance, they watched the Russian representative's Mercedes speeding out of town, leaving Blake and his forces alone. "You think this changes anything?" Blake shouted, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "We still outnumber you!" "Numbers," Friday's quiet laugh carried across their comms. "Son, you brought a street gang to a special operations fight." As if to emphasize the point, hidden lights suddenly illuminated the entire block, eliminating shadows the Reynolds team had planned to use for cover. Every sniper position they'd selected was already occupied by veterans who'd learned their trade in real combat. "Last chance," Mike offered. "Surrender now, face regular charges. Continue, and we provide the DEA with everything we've gathered about your operation, including your Russian connection." Inside the garage, Kevin watched the scene unfold. He won't back down. His pride won't let him. "We're counting on that." Richardson smiled grimly. Blake's response came in the form of gunfire, wild, untrained shots that proved more dangerous to his own men than their targets. The veterans' positions held firm, their return fire precise and measured, disabling vehicles, without harming drivers. "Phase 2, Mike ordered calmly. Throughout Cedar Heights, coordinated actions began. Reynolds' security members found their vehicles mysteriously disabled. Escape routes disappeared, communications jammed, years of combat experience combined. With modern technology and local support created an invisible net drawing ever tighter. "Impressive setup," Richardson observed, "but you know he's got an ace in the hole. Men like Blake always keep one last card to play." "That's what we're counting on," Mike replied, watching as the Reynolds formation began to crack under pressure. "Sometimes you have to let the enemy think he's got one last chance before you spring the real trap." The night was far from over, and the real battle was just beginning. But already the Reynolds group was learning a harsh lesson about the difference between intimidation and true tactical superiority. They'd brought numbers and aggression to face off against something far more dangerous. Veterans who'd never forgotten their training, their brotherhood, or their duty to protect their community. Blake's laughter cut through the night, carrying an edge of dangerous confidence that made Mike's combat instincts surge. "You think we didn't plan for this? You think we came unprepared?" On cue, 3 armored SUVs emerged from the community center's parking garage. Professional contractors in tactical gear deployed with military precision, their weapons and movements marking them as former special operations operators. "Private military contractors," Friday reported from his observation post. "Blackwater alumni may be worse. These aren't weekend warriors." Ruby's voice came urgently through their comms. "Found something in their files. They're not just here for the garage. They've got a whole backup plan. Underground storage in the old maintenance tunnels. Escape routes through the industrial park." "Makes sense," Richardson nodded. "Never put all your resources in one location. Basic tactical doctrine." Inside Thorne's auto service, now a hardened command center, Mike watched the mercenaries establish firing positions. Their deployment was textbook perfect, which made them predictable. Reynolds contractors who'd helped protect civilians stood alongside local veterans, the lines between them blurring. They'd come to Cedar Heights, looking for power through fear. Instead, they'd found a lesson in real strength, real brotherhood. Chief Martinez approached, holstering his weapon. "Got a choice to make," he told Blake. "Cooperate, help us shut down the Russian operations, maybe find some redemption, or go down with them." The night's events had shattered more than just the Reynolds group's control of Cedar Heights. They'd shattered the illusion that strength comes from intimidation rather than community. from fear rather than respect. "This isn't over," Richardson warned as federal agents began arriving. "The Russians won't take this loss lightly." "No," Mike agreed, watching as his neighborhood began to emerge from its defensive positions. "But now they know what they're dealing with, and so does everyone else." The sun would soon rise on a changed Cedar Heights. The battle had been won not just by tactical superiority or military experience, but by something more powerful, a community's refusal to be intimidated and the unbreakable bonds of true brotherhood. Dawn painted neighborhood streets in shades of gold, highlighting bullet holes and scattered debris from the night's conflict. Federal agents swarmed the area, processing evidence and taking statements, but Mike's team knew this was just the beginning. "Russians already making moves," Ruby reported, monitoring communications from their command center. "They're legitimate. Businesses are canceling contracts with local companies. They're trying to economically isolate the neighborhood." "Standard tactics," Richardson nodded. "Soften up the target before the real attack." Friday appeared silently, as was his habit. Got movement in 3 neighboring districts. Russians shifting assets, calling in specialists. This isn't over. Mike watched as FBI agents interviewed former Reynolds contractors. Blake sat with DEA investigators, his former bravado replaced by grim determination as he detailed the Russian operations. Outside, Chief Martinez managed the complex dance of multiple agencies claiming jurisdiction. "They're trying to help," Hammer observed, watching the federal response, "but they don't understand what they're really dealing with." "No," Mike agreed. "They think this is about drugs and crime. They don't see the bigger picture." Ruby's computer pinged with new information. "Got something. Russians aren't just about drugs. They've got legitimate corporations, political connections. Look at these campaign contributions." The evidence painted a disturbing picture. The Russians had spent years building a network of influence through seemingly legitimate businesses and political donations. Cedar Heights wasn't just a distribution hub. It was a test case for their larger strategy. If they can take a neighborhood like this, Richardson realized, they can take anywhere. Kevin, now working openly with Mike's team, brought more news. Reynolds security teams in other cities are falling apart. What happened here? It's spreading. Guys are choosing sides. The morning light revealed more of the engineers' preparations. The neighborhood hadn't just been fortified. It had been transformed into an integrated defensive position. Federal agents studied the modifications with professional interest.